Well, thanks very much, Don. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you here today. You know, as a full-time political journalist, it's a very agreeable novelty for me to be amongst people who actually work for a living and indeed earn vital export income for Australia. Now, I'm told that I'm to talk for 20 minutes and then we're to have 10 minutes of discussion. I recall the words of the great American statesman Adlai Stevenson in a similar circumstance to this. He said, for the next 20 minutes, it's my job to talk, your job to listen. If you should happen to finish your job before I finish my job, no hard feelings whatsoever. And she asked me not to, but I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Jacey, who's sitting down there in the front row. And I want to say to you, I'm going to say some controversial things. And if you find anything I say really objectionable, really foolish, really outrageous, please go and see Jacey after the session and she'll sort everything out for you. Now, the organisers asked me to talk about the key dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. So what are they? Now, Angus Houston, the former Chief of the Defence Force, who worked for a while as raising sheep in Western Australia before he was accepted into the Defence Force, he says that the environment we're living in now is the most dangerous strategic environment in his entire lifetime. And he's 75 or 76 years old. And he's a very calmly spoken man. So he's not prone to hysterical or exaggerated statements. I think he's right to say that it is the most dangerous strategic environment. But what does that mean and why is it so dangerous? I have to confess I can't offer you certainties. I can tell you that the chances of a major discontinuity, a black swan event, a huge disruption, which would certainly affect all your businesses, are rising. I don't know how you price that in as a business. I don't think it's possible really to account in a meaningful way in your business for the fact that, say, the possibility of a military conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan has risen from perhaps 1% 15 years ago to perhaps 30% now. That's an enormously radical change. It's still most likely there won't be such a conflict, but 1% to 30% is an enormous change. Where is the uncertainty coming from? So you can take a kind of a systems approach, if you like, and say the international system, the rules-based order that we love to talk about in Australia, is breaking down. What do we mean by that? Now, truly great powers throughout history typically attempt not only to dominate the international order, but to become the international system. And therefore, how you relate to the great power is really the underlying operating principle of the international system. That's certainly the case with the United States since World War II. The United States underwrote the international security system, but it also underwrote the international trade system, and it also underwrote the international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, even the United Nations, really, was essentially funded by the United States and given its credibility by the United States. Now, that order is breaking down as dissatisfied powers, you might call them rogue powers, but powers that want to change the system, especially China, Russia and Iran, are challenging that system. Let's alight just for a second on Russia. It's not exactly in the Indo-Pacific, but it affects what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and it's a very illustrative case. Let's just think for a second of the war, the Russian war on Ukraine. This war demonstrates the unpredictability of the international geostrategic situation today, because the whole war emanates from the mind of one man, Vladimir Putin. This is the inherent instability and unpredictability of one-man regimes, such as we now have in Russia and indeed in China. So I met Putin once, and he's certainly a very dynamic character, very charismatic in his way, quite funny, and very, very sinister, very dark in his humour, and always with an undercurrent of threatening innuendo in everything he says. Now, the ideology that Putin draws on is something that is part of Russian history. Extreme Russian nationalism, Eurasianism, as it's sometimes called, a mystical interpretation of Russian national destiny. All these are factors which any Russian leader would deal with. But the decision to invade Ukraine, which has had immense economic and institutional consequences around the world, that emanated entirely out of Putin's mind. It was entirely his decision, and it grew out of the interaction of his personal circumstances, the fact that he's 70 years old and he wants to recover the Russian Empire while he's still, in his view, at the height of his powers. The interaction of those circumstances and the paranoid and increasingly isolated personal environment that he's created for himself, the interaction of that with the objective factors of Russian history and ideology. Now, Putin certainly didn't expect the brilliant Ukrainian military resistance. He certainly didn't expect the Western solidarity with Ukraine, both in terms of sanctions and in terms of the weapons and economic support for Ukraine. However, this conflict will play directly into the Indo-Pacific in three ways. First of all, you've got tremendous economic disruption and a massive rise in commodity prices, which basically is good news for the Australian economy. For all the disruption that we've had, Australia is a winner out of the Ukraine war because although, you know, one part of politics tells us that coal is finished and all that sort of thing, in fact, all of our resources, coal and gas and iron ore and all the rest of it, are at almost record prices. Coal has never been more expensive. So as a resources economy, that's kind of been good for us. The second big result for the Indo-Pacific is that it confirms that Russia is a complete strategic client now of China, completely dependent on China. And the third result is that Russia is not beaten yet, even though it is losing badly in the war. A desperate or isolated Putin could well resort to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Already, Putin's nuclear threats have kind of normalised nuclear diplomacy in a security situation. That means our world has quite changed because of this. Nuclear weapons are coming back to the heart of geostrategic considerations, whereas really since the last years of the Cold War, they've been regarded as irrelevant to geostrategic situations. And if we get a conflict over Taiwan, the Chinese will take all the lessons from Russian nuclear diplomacy. But now, in the Indo-Pacific, let me describe key dynamics arising out of four key players: China, the United States, Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Obviously just a thumbnail sketch in each case. You can certainly criticise this presentation for not being comprehensive or for leaving things out. China is completely transformed now because of the 10 years of the rule of its president Xi Jinping. Xi is very much like Putin, except it's not culturally acceptable in the Chinese Communist Party to be flamboyant in the way that Putin is. But Xi is absolutely a one-man regime. So Xi is as near to an absolute dictator in China as Putin is in Russia. In fact, Xi is probably more secure in Beijing than Putin is in Russia. But this makes Beijing much harder to calculate and predict. Critical thing for Australia because China is our biggest trade partner and China is such a big influence in the Indo-Pacific. But it's much harder to predict what Chinese policy and behaviour will be like now because of Xi's rule. What are the key features of Xi's rule? It emphasises ideology rather than pragmatism. And the ideology it emphasises is not Confucianism. Forget anybody who tries to explain contemporary Chinese behaviour through traditional Chinese culture or anything like that. I was a correspondent in China way back in 1985, and when I was there, Confucius in fact was banned as a leftover of feudalism. The ideology that the Chinese leadership emphasises and studies and promulgates is Marxism-Leninism. And under Xi, the Chinese Communist Party puts ideology above economic growth. Under Xi, the party has destroyed the institutionalism and the collective structure of the Chinese leadership and of the Chinese legal system. After the chaos of Mao, Deng Xiaoping put in a system which would institutionalise Chinese leadership. The president was different from the party general secretary, was different from the chairman of the military commission. Xi has collapsed all that. He won't nominate a successor, and indeed he chose for the Standing Committee of the Politburo universally men who were older than the retirement age, so that none of them would emerge as an heir apparent. Of course, it is very dangerous in China to be the heir apparent. A lot of them end up, dying in aeroplanes unexpectedly and so forth. We've seen under Xi an extraordinary military build-up. Our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, says it's the biggest military build-up in peacetime in global history. It is also the case that never in our history has such a military build-up occurred without that military ultimately being used. I mean, if you spend all your wealth building the world's biggest hammer, you will eventually try to find a nail or two. China, under the leadership of Xi, has a very clear and often internally stated ambition to expel the United States militarily from Asia. This, of course, would be a fundamental consequence to Australia. As Xi made clear in his recent speeches at the Chinese Communist Party Congress, he wants China to become the dominant nation in the world by the middle of this century. And he has a very strong ambition to take Taiwan by force. Xi is, I think, 69, about the same age as Putin. He probably figures he's got 5 or 10 years of peak power left to him, and he wants to take Taiwan on his watch. He's made that very, very clear. In pursuit of all that, we see massive cyber intrusions by China all the time in our country and in allied countries, massive traditional espionage, massive commercial espionage, very exotic and extensive efforts at political interference, a very aggressive military posture in the waters around Japan, in the South China Sea, and of course in the waters and airspace around Taiwan. And very dangerous incidents at sea with the United States all the time. Future trends: China is going to be very assertive militarily. It's going to have lower economic growth in exchange for greater ideological control, and it's pioneered the brilliant use of technology to control its citizenship far beyond anything George Orwell ever dreamed of. And we don't know the limits of Chinese strategic ambition. Now, having said all that, the Chinese are definitely rational players, and the way they behave will be heavily dependent on how they view America. So that's the other great variable in the Indo-Pacific. What is America going to do? I think Putin was inclined to invade Ukraine because he saw the way the Americans left Kabul and Afghanistan, and he thought this is a weak power which won't take any decisive action. And he's been shocked at the degree of Western solidarity in Ukraine. And the Chinese have also observed that very closely, you can be sure. But whether they take military action on China, whether they extend their aggression in Japanese waters, and a whole lot of other things, depends on how they see America. They want to see America as in terminal decline. Now, as I speak, the midterm US elections, so what can we expect from America? The US midterm elections are on, and I was trying over lunch to get the latest results because it's a pretty difficult position to be interpreting to you what the meaning of these election results are, and anything I say can be falsified within about 2 hours. So if you turn on the evening news, you might find that my assessment is all wrong. But it seems still as though the Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives and the Senate is too close to call. So if the Democrats lose either one or both houses of Congress, you will get a more enfeebled and paralysed Biden administration for the last 2 years of the Biden term than you've had for the first 2 years. The key features of the US at the moment are internal polarisation an academic class which is hostile to the idea of America, the rise of tremendous vitriol and intolerance on the populist right and the activist left. They're both as bad as each other. And there's a broader political crisis. The US, like most Western nations, has no prospect of balancing its budget. It's simply making promises to itself in terms of transfer payments that it cannot honour. We're doing the very same thing in Australia. Most of Western Europe is doing the very same thing. So those are all the problems that the United States has. It's also the case that in the richest country, in the most powerful country in the history of the world, how can you possibly end up with a presidential choice of Donald Trump and Joe Biden? Very strange, the enfeebled versus the enraged. It's a very strange circumstance. Having said all that though, the American system has an ability to work through incompetent, feeble and divided presidencies very effectively. I know the national security team in Biden's team very well, Kurt Campbell, Anthony Blinken. They're very, very serious people and they command enormous resources. And I think the Chinese and others are counting America down too much. There is a very strong bipartisan position on China. I think the Biden administration has been good in its China policy. There is isolationism in both the left and the right. It'll be interesting to see if that emerges in the midterm elections. A Republican Congress would probably halt much of Biden's climate change action. It may impede a little funding for Ukraine. That would be extremely irresponsible. But if anything, it will be even stronger on China than Biden has been, and it will tend to push for greater US defence expenditure. But the bottom line question for the Indo-Pacific, is the US still reliable strategically and economically? What would a Mark II of the Trump presidency look like in 2 years' time? I think overall the Americans are still reliable strategically, and in any event we need them to be so, and therefore key US allies, Japan, South Korea and Australia, need to do everything we can to have capability ourselves in case the Americans are ever not there, but also capability ourselves to make sure the Americans prevail in any difficult circumstance. And if we have maximum capability and the Americans have maximum capability, that in any event sets up a system of deterrence which will be the greatest chance to maintain stability in our region. Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. So Southeast Asia, like North Asia, by the way, let's just be clear, couldn't care less about climate change. A complete baloney. They're not the slightest interest in any of that. In Indonesia, they pay fuel subsidies. Far from having a carbon tax, they have a carbon subsidy. They'll pay you money to burn fossil fuels. Coal is booming in China. They've announced huge production increases in coal in China. Of course, they're going to deploy a lot of renewable energy as well. And of course, they want to clean up their environment and reduce pollution. But they're not the slightest bit interested in the Western game of climate targets and all that. Southeast Asia is very cynical and uninterested about these issues. But Southeast Asia is not going through its best period. Indonesia has solidly preserved democracy, which is magnificent. It's got a very mediocre economic growth profile, but it's such a big society and such a big economy that it's still going to grow. I had the pleasure of interviewing Anthony Albanese a week ago on his defence plans, and he quoted to me projections that Indonesia will be a top 5 economy by the middle of this century. That may or may not come true, but Indonesia is certainly going to be a big factor. But Indonesia is essentially an inward-looking power, doesn't project much. Thailand has very difficult internal politics, finding it very difficult to return to democracy. The Philippines has more or less returned to normal. Malaysia is chronic political conflict by the very same people who were running Malaysian politics when I began in journalism 45 years ago. They are deathless. Dr. Mahathir is running again at age 96. It's fantastic. Every time I meet John Howard, I say to him, look, you're a young man. You can have another go. Come back. Myanmar has reverted to military dictatorship. Cambodia is a sclerotic dictatorship and client state of China. Singapore is the most stable and prosperous Southeast Asian state and our great friend. Now, Southeast Asia will not be dominated by China ever. but nor will it be a reliable, forward-leaning ally of the United States. The critical allies in this region for the US are Japan, South Korea and Australia, and the critical swing states are India and Vietnam. Vietnam's a very successful society at the moment. And to conclude, just a word on the South Pacific. The South Pacific, unlike Southeast Asia, takes climate change very seriously. They don't have very big economies and they see themselves as victims of climate change and believe they can get some aid and some compensation out of it. The new Albanese government has got good rhetoric on climate change as far as the South Pacific is concerned, and so it's a bit more popular with them than the previous government was. The key conflict for us is that China wants to build a military base in the South Pacific and we want to stop them. And we're going to use every bit of our treasury resources and diplomatic resources to stop them. A Chinese military base in the South Pacific would be extraordinarily damaging for Australia. Now, with all of those happy thoughts, I think I'll wind up there and we've got time for a little discussion.
So thanks, Greg, and intriguing as usual. So let's quickly go to questions, please, if there are any. I'd hate to see you come all this way, Greg, and that not happen. There's got to be an inquiring mind in this room. There it is, right there.
Thanks, Greg. Role of Japan, big economy, obviously been very important for a long time. Where do they sit in all this?
Well, Japan is a critically important power. I had the great pleasure of interviewing, in a written interview, Prime Minister Kishida a couple of weeks ago, and he has recently announced that they're going to double their defence budget to 2% of their GNP, and they have a reciprocal alliance with the United States. They've also, Albanese and Kishida had a joint security declaration in their meeting in Perth a couple of weeks ago, which used very intentionally almost exactly the same language as exists in our ANZUS treaty. Now, Japan is an increasingly important military power. By the way, if the United States ever is expelled from this region militarily, the logic is that Japan and South Korea would have to become nuclear weapons states, or they would have to become servant states to China, one or the other. So the US alliance system prevents nuclear proliferation. The degree of mutual hostility and antipathy between Japan, China and Korea in Northeast Asia is absolutely spectacular, and it goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Japanese are a determined opponent of Chinese hegemony. They are America's most important ally in the Indo-Pacific, more important than us. They are determined that China will not take Taiwan because they would be the chief victims. If China takes Taiwan, it not only gets its semiconductor industry, but it gets the capacity to project power directly onto Japan to interrupt all its shipping routes and so forth. The Japanese are not in a vigorous phase of economic growth, there's no doubt about that, but their economy is holding steady, it's holding its own. The new strategic orientation of Japan, which was pioneered by Shinzo Abe, who's recently assassinated, is not really contentious. So they haven't formally changed their constitution to allow formal military alliances beyond the one they have with the United States, but they've simply reinterpreted the constitution to allow them to do everything. So they remain an absolutely critical nation. They provide development capital and investment capital for the South Pacific and for Southeast Asia. They've teamed up with India to do a lot of that. They've teamed up with us and the Americans in the Quad. They're very active diplomatic players. They've got a brilliant ambassador in Canberra. They're an absolutely critical state. So the big actors in the Indo-Pacific, the United States, China, India and Japan, really, those four are in a class of their own. And we have a very profound, deep friendship with Japan, which was pioneered in the 1950s and has gone on ever since. And it's a very good thing, and we ought to pay a bit more attention to it. But they seem to be rock solid at the moment, and it's a very good thing, in my view, if a bit belated, that they are expanding they're already formidable military. They have very formidable military forces as it is, but they're going to expand those, I think, in submarines and missiles and asymmetric warfare capabilities. Now, all of that makes war much less likely. The stronger Japan and Australia and the United States are, the less likely you are to have a real security emergency. So I think Japan, critical player and very, very constructive player at this stage.
So there's just a question over on the front here.
Don, I've got one while you're waiting for a mic.
Okay, go ahead.
Greg, thanks for just to your right. Thanks for your presentation. Really interesting. Yeah, we've certainly seen some dramatic food price inflation across the world, and last time we saw that sort of inflation in 8-9, we saw some challenges in the Middle East. Interested in your thoughts on food price inflation and stability, but also opportunity for Australia in Southeast Asia and North Asia and up into China, and what that could mean.
Well, that's right. There's so many different factors contributing to food price inflation at the moment. Obviously, the suspension of the Ukrainian grain supplies for a period was a big factor in that. There's the energy crisis in Western Europe, brought on both by their dependence on Russia and also their movement to renewables before they had storage technology which made it feasible and without firming backup power. Now, I'm a tremendous contrarian on all this, but this is only happening in a certain part of the globe, you know. North America, Western Europe, New Zealand and Australia. I spend a lot of my life in Asia, less so during COVID obviously, and you know, you can barely raise a discussion on climate change in Asia, and every now and again you ask an Indonesian minister what they're doing about it and they just kind of shrug, you know. They say, yeah, we're doing all kinds of renewable things, but we've also got 100 coal-fired power plants approval, and China, I think, has 300 coal-fired power plants that it's constructing. Overall, though, the rise in food prices is good for Australian producers, as are the rise of commodity prices. The big challenge to our prosperity is our internal politics. So every single productive thing we do, our mineral exports, our agricultural exports, they are all subject to a substantial contrary political campaign. You know, the government's committed to phasing out live sheep exports. You know, we're going to stop our cattle from emitting methane. Where, you know, half the Greens think that it's immoral to eat animals, and so on and so on and so on. But of course, our wealth is no more guaranteed to us than any other nation's wealth. We've been the lucky country, and these commodity price booms are still very good for us. But we're having trouble now. So the critical transition technology in energy is gas. We're having trouble getting financing for a lot of our gas projects, whereas the world desperately needs and wants more gas. So the world is trying to make us rich. Whether we're going to allow the world to do that is a big question in Australian politics, I think.
There was a question over the...
Yeah, thank you.
Peter Barnard, sorry.
Thanks, Greg. Very, very interesting talk. I must admit, you alarmed me, and I think a lot of people in this audience, with the assessment that a war over Taiwan during the next decade was 30%. I mean, that seems an extraordinarily high probability to me. I was interested in your assessment of the impact of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine on that probability. I was somewhat relieved that you said that the Chinese were rational people, and if they're rational, they might assess that a war with Taiwan might be a bit more difficult than they previously thought perhaps it would be. And I'm also interested in your assessment of the ability of Taiwan to offer the sort of resistance that's occurred in Ukraine. I mean, you don't hear much about the military power in Taiwan and their ability to resist China with help from outside.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for that question. It's so thoughtful and so interesting. So the assessment that there's, say, a 30% chance of war over Taiwan is not my assessment. That is the assessment of the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who made a statement a couple of weeks ago that he thought China was hastening its timeline for taking Taiwan, and he thought something could happen in the next year. I interviewed Blinken when he was here for the Auckland talks at the beginning of the year. Here's your typical American East Coast policy Brahmin, you know, too many university degrees, more brains than any man could ever have any use for, so smooth, so careful, so thoughtful, a diligent public servant. He is the last person in the world to shoot his mouth off. That's his assessment as Secretary of State. Now, we've seen the Americans publish intelligence in order to try to influence Russian behaviour. It seems to me he's doing the same thing here. But he is not alone in this. The US Commander of Naval Operations, he made an even more startling statement that he thought China might take action against Taiwan this year. Now again, these are not isolated statements. I've quoted Taiwan's intelligence chief saying that he thought something big would happen in 2023. His scenario was more the threat of war by China to try to make Taiwan negotiate. So there is a line of analysis that China sees how difficult Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, sees the strength of Western reaction and says, that's harder than we thought, and maybe pulls back. I hope that's right. There is another line of analysis which says China sees how incompetent the Russian military was, knows that its military won't be incompetent, sees how foolish it was for the Russians to flag their intentions for months in advance, knows that it will have to strike by surprise, sees how ineffective in the end China's cyber aggression against Ukraine was, knows that it will be able to get a much greater cyber effect against Taiwan much more quickly. You raise the question, could Taiwan defend itself? In the long run, no, but it would need to hold out for 3 or 4 weeks while the Americans got busy. The Chinese have designed their military system to make life very dangerous for the Americans in the Western Pacific, and this is essentially by reliance on missiles and drones. The Americans are taking countermeasures. The Americans are not foolish, especially the military commanders. They are they're dispersing their forces, they're hardening their bases, making them resistant to missile strikes. They are increasing their long missile strike capability of their own. But that is contributing to the Chinese thinking, well, maybe time is against us. Maybe we don't want the Americans to finish all their preparations, because at the end of the day, the American economy is still much, much bigger than China's economy. And American high-tech military equipment is much more sophisticated than Chinese high-tech equipment in most areas. And so they might be saying, look, we've got a feeble US president, we've got a very divided US politics. The West has kind of exhausted its reserves of ammunition and missiles and artillery shells and so on by supplying Ukraine, and plainly doesn't have enough inventory. You've got Europe in desperate trouble with winter coming along because of the energy shortages. Now, I don't think the Chinese are going to make this calculation. So even 30% is less, you know, it's less than even money. But much smarter people than me, who study the Chinese constantly, believe that there is a serious body of opinion within the Chinese leadership which says actually moving more quickly rather than more slowly. At last, the Japanese are significantly raising their military, although it's already been significant. At last, it looks as though Australia is about to significantly increase our military effort. Heaven forfend, you know, the age of miracles is upon us. The net assessment is, I still think sanity will prevail. And a lot of people are saying to the Chinese, so Blinken and the Navy and guy and so on are making these statements partly because they're statements to the Chinese. They're saying, look, we're aware of what you're thinking of. We've got pretty good sources and we know just what you're thinking about. And rest assured, we're prepared for it. We're ready to go. And of course, you know, people talk about waking the Chinese dragon, waking the American dragon. The Americans are a very warlike people. You know, have you ever seen an American movie without guns in it? You know, you pick a fight with the Americans, really a serious fight. It's one thing to go after their proxies, But if the Americans intervened directly to defend Taiwan and the Chinese fired on the Americans, so far the Russians have not fired on the Americans at any point. People criticise NATO expansion, but Russia has not made any serious action against any of the NATO members on its borders: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, all former Soviet bloc nations, now members of NATO. Russia has not gone anywhere near them. It's gone after the nations which are not members of NATO. So, I mean, it's pathetic, isn't it? You think you pay a journalist his money, he ought to make a fool of himself by giving you a hard and fast prediction. But my best prediction, following those most serious analysts, is we're at about a 25 or 30%. But you're right to regard that as extremely serious. This ought to be the focus of a big part of our national conversation. Because, of course, I'll leave you with this thought. Whatever the disruption of the war in Ukraine, a war over Taiwan would be orders of magnitude more disruptive, orders of magnitude. Our trade would stop on day one. I think if there were a war, we would support the Americans and we would send forces to join the Americans. But whether we did that or not, we couldn't export iron ore to a country which is at war with the Americans. All of our exports to China stop on day one of the conflict. The disruption of the global economy would be cataclysmic. As a result, therefore, my bottom line feeling is that the worst won't happen. But the worst has moved from being completely unthinkable 15 years ago to being a serious possibility now. And it's my job to cheer you up by drawing your attention to that melancholy possibility.